This particular presentation, I wanted to look at how religion plays a role in mental health for internationally displaced peoples. And these three case studies, you'll see I chose for their geographic and ethnic differences, as well as the circumstances surrounding the push factors, the causes for why they would pursue resettlement, which I'll get into a little bit later. These were the questions that sort of guided my research. What does mental health support already look like for these refugees? What other considerations should there be in strengthening mental health resources? And how does religious coping vary between situations? So, by situations, I basically mean just the circumstances surrounding resettlement, migration, and also the factors that push refugees out of their home country. Um, oh, there we go. So, I first started by looking at the existing mental health scene for migrants, refugees, internationally displaced peoples, and noted that about 1 in 3 refugees experience high rates of depression, anxiety, and PTSD. There are support systems that are emerging, particularly in Europe for refugees as short-term government projects, but they're mostly centered around welfare as a solution. There are other NGOs like UA Mental Health, Resilience Hub, and community-based organizations that sort of lead the front for mental health support for refugees. And the UNHCR does have programs in place to kind of prioritize refugee mental health needs, but there are some hurdles to these sorts of programs. Some of the most obvious would probably be things like financial support or even research into mental health. But this was in a 2001 essay called Changing Paradigms in the Mental Health Care of Refugees, which discusses how the Western biomedical approach towards refugee mental health and the refugee experience is sort of condensed and put within a very rigid framework. That means that refugees aren't really allowed to discuss or interpret their own stories on their own terms. It's all expected to fit within a certain template of mental health and is examined in the same way. When in reality, we know that the circumstances surrounding refuge can vary greatly from person to person. Um, Another clarification that I want to make before getting into the specific case studies is the language of refugees, migrants, and immigrants. You'll note that I discuss Ukrainian and Congolese refugees, but Mexican migrants. Now, the definition of refugee in academia is kind of contentious, but the definition adopted by the UNHCR and widely acknowledged is someone who has been forced to flee conflict or persecution and has crossed an international border to seek safety. That's the definition I'll be using in this presentation. I have my own personal qualms with it, but Mexican migrants don't typically always fit that definition of persecution. We'll talk more about the particular push factors that influence Mexican migrants, but this study will refer to them as migrants rather than refugees. Um, Now we can get into the case studies a little bit. So Ukrainian refugees, the Ukrainian crisis was a result of the Russian-Ukrainian war, which is ongoing. It has a very spanning history, but I looked primarily at resettlement in Poland for refugees. There's over 6 million Ukrainian refugees globally. This is kind of one slice of the pie. But I kind of looked at it because the majority of Ukrainian refugees identify as Christian Orthodox, and Poland is a Roman Catholic country. Part of the challenge of resettling to a new area where your religion is not predominant is kind of having to come to terms with the fact that you might not be able to practice your religious rites as much as you would like to, or attend Mass. All of things that provide support in the homeland and that can provide support in resettlement as well. Those things are lacking when you're in a more foreign country that might not have those support systems. And there's two types of religious coping that's found among Ukrainian refugees, positive and negative. Positive religious coping is kind of this idea that obstacles are interpreted with resilience, and divine providence can contribute to that sort of resilience. Negative religious coping is the idea that all these obstacles are interpreted as punishments from God as well. So those are kind of the two sides of the coin that were observed in Ukrainian refugees. Moving forward a little bit to Congolese refugees, I looked at their resettlement in the United States. Now, most Congolese people identify as Catholic. And the Democratic Republic of the Congo has a pretty distinct connection with the Catholic Church. In 2017, there was a bilateral framework agreement between the government of the DRC and the Holy See. The Pope even visited the Congo back in 2023 and called for the resilience of their people to fight to preserve their dignity and territorial integrity. The Congolese crisis is one of the most complex humanitarian crises in the world. And in recent years, it's intensified into, I believe, different criminal activities and a violent surge and those sort of things, the resurgence of armed groups and also gender-based violence. Now, among Congolese refugees, there's a bit of a stigmatization of mental health. And I think that might primarily be why we see a lot of these mental health programs kind of formulating in the Western world, like in Europe, rather than in the global South. And that's something that's not just found among Congolese refugees, but also in our third case study among Mexican migrants. We were looking at mental health as stigmatized, with a lot of people not necessarily taking advantage of the resources available to them. One of the primary people that I want to point out in the case study I observed for Mexican migrants is Sister Norma Pimentel. She's one of the heads of Catholic Charities and does work on the Rio Grande. And her guiding thesis, which I used as part of my conclusion, is the idea of restoring humanity and dignity to migrants on the border, regardless of their legal status. Something else that I also observed in Mexican migrants is the idea of Christianity as a push factor. Now, most Latinos in the United States identify as Catholic and identify as highly religious, and that's around 80%. And Christianity is something that's not only seen throughout the migration process as a coping strategy or throughout the process of resettlement in the new country, but for Mexican migrants, it's also kind of a push factor for them. Many Mexican migrants report the idea of pursuing a new or better life in the United States as a reason for their push factor and the reason why they decide to migrate. But it's also seen that a lot of churches provide these frameworks and this information about immigrating and migrating. And there's one ritual called the Posada of the Migrant, which some border churches conduct, which is essentially a roving pageant of the nativity story that they conduct around Christmas. That allows churches to share both their culture and their faith with neighboring communities around them and discuss the concept of migration in the context of Christianity and Catholicism. So what does all of this mean? I observed throughout my study a lot of different treatment and variation between how, say, Ukrainian migrants were discussed in media or treated in resettled areas compared to Congolese migrants or Mexican migration. So with Ukrainian refugees, a lot of them reported a welcoming kind of environment. Even with the challenges that they confronted, a lot of the people in Poland were able to accommodate them and did their best to do so. Now, with Congolese migrants, a lot of women report sexual violence being directed towards them. Mexican migration has been a hot button topic for many years, and in media studies, there's a ton of inflammatory language about Mexican migration that criminalizes them. And on top of that, the Ukrainian crisis has had a lot more coverage globally, not just in the United States, pertaining to this kind of humanitarian crisis compared to the Congolese humanitarian crisis, as well as the circumstances of Mexican migration. Ultimately, religion can encourage comfort and stability during both the migration and resettlement process. So it's something that needs to be considered as part of the mental health institutions that we're looking at for our refugees. Religious coping manifests most distinctly as ritual and prayer. It can exist both negatively and positively, but all of those considerations and those dimensions need to be present in mental health in the way of humanizing and, as Sister Norma Pimentel says, restoring dignity to refugees, a group of people who so often are left behind by our systems and are viewed as statistics rather than people. Religion is part of identity, and that in and of itself can humanize the refugee and migrants. And here are my sources. If I could just
say something? Thank you. That
Yes,
was
by all
wonderful.
means, just chime in. I think it's best to give feedback or questions right after a presentation, like a couple, yeah, rather than at the end. Thank you,
Well,
Nance.
I loved your presentation, and I just wanted to say, I put in the chat an event we're having next week, which you mentioned, Sister Norma Pimentel. We have a presentation coming to the Core Center next Wednesday, and there's a link, and you'll see Sister Norma. Unfortunately, she herself is not coming, but Mary Peters, the woman in the picture, and that's Father Benny, who is my pastor. That we've had a couple of trips from my parish. I have not, unfortunately, gone yet, but I'd like to go at some point in the future to the border working with Sister Norma. And so if you have the ability on Wednesday at 3:30 next week, please join us with Dr. Alfani. Is this a class, Dr. Alfani, that you said you might bring to the talk?
No, actually, Billy took that class last semester or 2 semesters ago.
Last semester.
Oh, okay.
But you are more than welcome to join us next week, Billy.
Yeah.
And
I'd
all the
definitely
other
like
students
to.
as well. Yeah.
And we'll have
Okay,
refreshments.
I just want to thank you, Isabel. It looks like your research is quite extensive. I just had one question. When you said that the Congolese and the Mexican immigrants stigmatize mental health, what do you mean by that? I mean, I know what stigmatized means, but I want to know in context, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure, definitely. So that was like obviously a survey statistic, self-reported, just whether or not people were comfortable pursuing help and mental health resources. There's the idea, so specific, I wish I could have included this more. I felt like there was so much information that might have been lacking. But for Mexican refugees, I found a report that discussed how mental health and discussions of, say, depression or PTSD, those were discussed in the home life and in like between family members as demons or being possessed in some kind of way, or just not something that would, you would look for traditional mental health aid and seek, because it's something where you might want to keep it hidden. You might not want to ask for help, especially professional help, because it suggests that there's something that is wrong with you. Spiritually, specifically, which we're talking about religion, that's something where religion can play a part in stigmatizing mental health as well. So, we should treat religion sort of neutrally in the context of mental health. It can both help and harm these sort of pursuit of mental health support and aid for, not just refugees. It's something that can be applied to almost anyone, but there are considerations that need to be had.
Thank you so much, because I know when talking to my students, sometimes they'll say culturally that pursuing a mental health aid is not treated with, like they don't embrace it because it is personal, private. It is something they keep in close. So I was just wondering if it was the same. Thank you so much. Okay, Leanne, we're ready for you. Are you ready for us? So I don't know, Nancy, are you sharing your screen?
No, I'm not. No, I didn't mean to if I was.
Oh, here, I'll stop sharing. That's me.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you. So Leanne is doing her presentation on the November 2015 Paris attacks, a comparative analysis of French religious policy and Catholic Church responses to religious extremism. So we look forward to hearing about this. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. Can everyone see my slides okay? All right, perfect. Okay, so thank you for introducing me. My name is Leanne, and I'll be talking about the November 2015 Paris attacks. And we're really going to be looking at the different responses from the French government and the Catholic Church in their reaction to religious extremism. So my primary research question when doing my work on the conflict was, what were the responses to the attacks from the French government and the Catholic Church, and what were the effects of those responses? So I kind of broke it down into sub-questions to look at different aspects of the conflict leading up to it and following, just to get a better idea of what was going on. So just to give some kind of general background, the attacks occurred on November 13th, 2015, when a number of gunmen and suicide bombers, who were later claimed by ISIS, struck several locations around Paris, killing 130 people and leaving hundreds of others injured. So just to give some context, in case anyone isn't aware, ISIS stands for the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, and it's essentially an extremist sect of Islam with a very violent history with a lot of nations around the world. Just to give some context of the amount of power that they had in the Middle East at the time, this map on the left shows some of the areas that they had control of and some of the territory that they had gained and lost in that year during the attacks, just to give a little bit of context of their control and oversight in the Middle East especially. So when looking at the conflict, there were a number of different actors that I found to be involved, ranging from the terrorists who carried out the attacks to higher level figures such as the Catholic Church and the leaders of ISIS and the French government. For the purposes of this presentation, I'll really be focusing on the French state and politicians, or the state actors, and then the Catholic Church as a non-state actor. So to start, the first response from the French government was enacted by President Francois Hollande, who was the president in France at the time of the attacks. And I do actually want to mention some background information leading up to the attacks. So it's important to note that France actually has the largest Muslim population in Western Europe. And so prior to the attacks, there had been a lot of what could be considered anti-Islamic domestic policy in France. So things like the headscarf ban of 2004 and the face concealment ban of 2010 really infringed upon a lot of religious freedoms, particularly for Muslim women. And the government justified this with anti-radicalization sentiment, saying that they were trying to prevent religious extremism from occurring, when really all this kind of accomplished was preventing citizens from having a trusting relationship with the government. So it created a lot of tension that really set the stage for the attacks themselves. After the attacks, the French government enacted a nationwide state of emergency, which actually lasted for 2 full years until November 2017. And during the state of emergency, there was a lot of increased policing, especially for Muslim communities in France. And there were a number of other policies enacted that were highly controversial in France as a whole. So some of these anti-terrorism policies that they enacted actually became an anti-terror law in 2017. Some of these policies included allowing police to search homes without judicial pre-approval, and also shutting down religious institutions that the government considered to be promoting radical ideas, and a number of other measures that just aimed to prevent that religious extremism, to kind of prevent attacks from occurring before they even started. So in contrast to this, the response from the Catholic Church was enacted by Pope Francis, our current Pope, and he essentially publicly condemned the attacks and very much advocated for peace, even in the face of such horrifying violence. Associated with the Catholic Church, there were 2 relief organizations that really participated in a lot of rebuilding of the community. So one of those was the Secours Catholique, and another one was the Catholic Relief Services, or CRS. So these are 2 organizations highly associated with the Catholic Church that essentially worked on funneling donations and collecting money to really support rebuilding after the attacks for the communities that were most affected. So some of the long-term effects of these responses, as you can see on the right, there was actually a significant drop in Islamist-inspired terrorist attack associated fatalities and injuries. In 2015, when the attacks occurred, you can see a huge drop to 2017, when the anti-terror law was officially enacted. So as we can see, the policies, while aggressive, were very, very effective in curbing attacks. However, many people, French citizens, were very angry at the profiling and over-policing of French Muslim citizens. And there was also a lot of widespread anti-Muslim sentiment because a lot of people inaccurately assumed that ISIS was representative of the Islamic faith as a whole, which is obviously completely untrue. It's just a very radical extremist sect. So this anti-terror law enacted in 2017 was expected to end in 2021, but many of its policies were actually permanently renewed by the French President Emmanuel Macron on July 30th, 2021, which was a fairly controversial decision because, as I mentioned before, a lot of people considered this a huge overreach of government power and saw a lot of negative impacts on Muslim communities. However, a lot of people were very approving of this due to its effectivity in reducing attacks. So just to summarize some general conclusions, the French state was really responsible for effectively reducing terrorist attacks by enacting the anti-terror law and giving a little bit more power to police. However, this resulted in a lot of racial profiling and over-policing of Muslim communities. whereas the Catholic Church really just advocated for peace above all else and helped direct financial aid to these communities to kind of aim towards repairing the damage, both mental and physical, to these communities that were affected. They also emphasized support for Muslims and reminded that ISIS is not representative of Islam as a whole, while still denouncing the violence, and said that violence is never justified by religion. So essentially, I think what we can really take away here is that both state and non-state actors have really important roles to play in conflict resolution. So we can see that they have different advantages and different reaches of power. And I think that what's really important here is that it's important for them to work together in order to rebuild community following such violent attacks, such as the November 2015 attacks, and help ensure a lasting rebuild and healthy community for France when responding to both domestic and foreign conflicts. So this is how we can really reach true resolution, by utilizing both state actors, such as the government, and non-state actors, such as the Catholic Church. And I just have my references here. Thank you.
I'm sorry, my mic wasn't going on. I was
No
clicking and
worries.
clicking. Oh, that was wonderful. Leanne, would someone like to make a comment or have a question for Leanne?
It was very interesting, Leanne, and I remember when that event happened, and of course the different responses. I remember Pope Francis saying something that was interesting. I mean, of course, obviously he condemned the attack, but there was something that he said when there was the attack on the it was the attack on the newspaper that had said some anti-Islamic. Do you remember? That was like, it wasn't the same thing, but it was. And I remember he wasn't justifying it at all, but he said, like, but he compared it to like insulting one's mother. He was saying, like, you can't. He was. I think what he's able to do that's really quite remarkable is, like, he's able to condemn violence, but also to show some kind of understanding of the mentality of people who might perpetuate violence, even though he doesn't ever justify it. Do you know what I'm saying? And
yeah, absolutely. Actually, building off that, I think, are you talking about the Charlie Hebdo shooting?
Yes, the Charlie Hebdo.
Yeah, so I think essentially what happened, for anyone who might not know, essentially, I think it was a newspaper that published a caricature of the Prophet Muhammad, I believe.
Yes, that's right.
Who's a very important figure in the Quran and in the Islamic faith. And obviously this was a huge offense to a lot of Muslims, because portrayals, I believe, of the Prophet are not accepted. And it was a caricature, so it was not respectful in any way. And yeah, I think what you're saying is that Pope Francis was he's obviously, like, condemns violence, but he also was saying that they also have God, and they also would take offense at him being portrayed, at religious figures being portrayed in a way that is not true to their religion. So I think, yeah, the advantage of having a figure such as the Catholic Church in that is that they can preach the peace and nonviolence while also saying, let's have empathy for these people and let's see why they did this. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I just thought you were speaking. I was thinking about that. Thank you so much. A great presentation.
Thank you.
Yes, it was. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
So if you unshare your screen, we can begin with next, Megan. You're on. So Megan is going to be presenting, Megan Bruns, Global Climate Crisis and the Catholic Church, the role of the Holy See and Catholic Relief Services. Is your interest in the environment?
Yes.
One of your interests? Yes, me too. Okay,
I love
thank
it.
you.
I'm just going to share my screen. Let me just try to figure out how to do it.
Do you need help? Okay, you're good.
I think I got it. Everyone can see it?
You did.
Okay, perfect. Let me go back to the title slide. Okay, so as mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the global climate crisis, and I'm going to be relating this to the Catholic Church. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about the Holy See, which is more of like the governmental and political aspects of the Catholic Church, as well as Catholic Relief Services, which is more of the religious aspects of the Catholic Church. So this is a little agenda of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to go over a brief introduction, and then I'm going to go over some statistics of the climate crisis, as well as some causes versus the impacts. And then I'm going to dive into the Catholic Church. First up, the Catholic Relief Services, like I mentioned before, and the Holy See. And I'm also going to provide some solutions and recommendations for the environment. So the climate crisis, as we know, it takes a really large toll on human beings and the environment that we live in. It's causing extreme shifts in weather patterns, the global temperature, and it's affecting the air that we breathe and the land and the water that we also inhabit. And it's putting human beings at risk worldwide. Part of why I think it's so important, and especially that we address this today, because it's affecting our everyday lives, our health, and all sorts of things just like that. I also think it's important to mention that although everyone's affected by the climate crisis, I think certain marginalized groups are definitely affected at larger rates. I did some research on oil pipelining, and a lot of oil pipelining that's being used like for manufacturing, things like that, is being actually built on indigenous lands. So it's important to realize that everyone is affected, but there are certain groups that are experiencing the climate crisis at a larger rate. And I think it's very important that we're at a very defining moment now, because everybody's affected in some way by the use or the misuse, really, of our environment. So these are just some statistics that I found online as I was doing some research, and part of why I think that the call to action is so important, because everything is really only intensifying and getting worse as the years go by. Even though people are making some efforts, but I think there are some large statistics that are important to look at. So recent studies that were conducted by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration revealed that human activities add about 11 billion metric tons of carbon to the atmosphere every year. And in 2021, the global carbon dioxide levels were 60% higher than they were in 1990. And this past July, August, and September, global temperatures were more than 1 degree Celsius above the long-term average. This is the first time in their history that any month has breached that threshold. So these are obviously very extreme values, and it's important. I feel like it shows how intense this crisis is, and a lot of people, I think, do tend to brush it off. So I think it's important that people see these types of numbers, understand that it's something that we definitely have to start taking care of. So this is just some pictures of the oil pipelining actually that I mentioned before on the indigenous lands. And then on the left is kind of just like a comprehensive image and showing some of the negative outcomes of the climate crisis. So environmental degradation, natural disasters, weather extremes, as well as food and water insecurity. And then here I kind of made just like a graphic of the the causes of the climate crisis and what they lead to. So we have transportation and powering cars. Let's have a lot of greenhouse gases, industrialization, energy uses, deforestation, agriculture, and livestock. And then all of these things, they burn fossil fuels, they lead to global warming, and they emit greenhouse gases. And the accumulation of all of these things is what's fueling the climate crisis. So I just put some pictures along with everything just to get kind of visual of what's going on. So that now I'm going to be talking about the Catholic Church's role. So first up, I'm going to be talking about Catholic Relief Services. So this is more of like the religious realm of the Catholic Church, and this organization is focused on human life and its protection, and they're just basically centered around helping life to flourish. They're devoted to a lot of the Catholic social teachings that we're taught about, so life and dignity of the human person, as well as care for God's creation. And they actually launched a campaign on climate action, and they work shoulder to shoulder with communities to survive in the face of climate change. So they actually have this campaign that they launched where they're working towards combating climate change. They look at human beings as children of God, and they want to ensure the environment that we all call home is protected and taken care of. So they do so by acting in the climate crisis. This is just a little picture. There's an online video I found of just them explaining their work for the climate crisis campaign. So this is a little snippet that I took from it. But they basically just were talking about their mission and what they're working on for the climate crisis. And then the next arm of the Catholic Church is the Holy See. So this is like the jurisdiction or governmental body of the Catholic Church, and more of like the governmental and political role, as opposed to the CRS, which is more religious. Pope Francis takes a lead here, and he has shown longstanding leadership on the imperative to tackle the climate crisis, calling on political leaders and civil society to care for the environment. So Pope Francis is really taking charge here, and the Holy See plays a very important role in following up with states and with the United Nations in their goals regarding the climate crisis. So the Holy See, they actually hold a permanent seat at the UN. So they attend their conferences, and of importance for my presentation is the UN climate change conferences. So at those, different member states meet and they discuss environmental issues and they make goals that they're going to discuss and try to work on. So the Holy See was at COP23, which happened in 2017. And they were also at COP27 in Egypt. And Pope Francis was also supposed to go to COP28, but last minute there was some medical issues, so he wasn't cleared to go, but he was planning on attending. So this is their confirmed attendance at the last one, COP27 since 28. Pope Francis wasn't able to make it to, but this is just their attendance. You can see on the right side, I have just had a list of some of the people's names that are part of the Holy See that attended COP27. And this is just a picture from COP27. You can kind of just get a feel for what goes on there. Obviously, there's a bunch of people gathered and they had different presentations and people from different countries just talking about their respective goals for the environment and how everyone can work together to really make a change. And then lastly, I just have some solutions and recommendations. So obviously for the climate crisis, it's important to use renewable energy, increase energy efficiency, try to reduce our consumption and our waste as much as possible, and make more sustainable decisions, as well as, of course, trying to protect our natural resources. And then I have starred here the help and involvement of the Catholic Church, because I really think it's important to have a non-state actor to address the climate crisis, because I feel like a lot of the states are involved in creating all of the waste and perpetuating it. And I think that a non-state actor like the Catholic Church is able to kind of like leverage their moral authority and they have such a worldwide, like a global reach, and they can use this for good and to promote environmental stewardship and social justice and just kind of get the word out there and try to help people to see what's really going on and how serious it truly is. And the Catholic Church, they also suggest a dialogical approach where the whole globe is included, because the climate crisis is not an issue. It's a human crisis. It's not something that it's for one location. It's something that everybody's experiencing, and that we're united in that. So I think it's important to draw attention to these arms of the Catholic Church and spark conversation, just raise awareness and have everybody come together to really combat the climate crisis together. And these are just my sources.
Megan, that's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
So does anyone have any comments or questions for Megan about her presentation, or just connections?
Mhm.
I think my connection would be, I had taught a core 3 class on sustainability in the marine environment with
Mhm.
Dr. Marion Glenn, and we read Pope Francis's Laudato Si. And so it's not, he's a chemist, right? So he's very educated on this topic. I mean,
Mhm.
it's a wonderful document.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, we actually read that in Dr. Alfani's class.
Yes,
we read that, and
yes.
I included that in the one I presented about this also in that class, and I actually included pieces of that in that presentation, but I took them out for time for this one.
Yes,
But
and thank
I
you
did
all
mention
for,
that in that one.
yeah, for keeping with the time.
Mhm.
So does anyone else want to comment? Question? Okay, well, we have a presenter who's not here, Carolyn, and so that leaves us with Joe. Joe, you're presenting on navigating legal landscapes in the age of artificial intelligence, a critical examination of current regulations and future challenges. Joe, what class is this from?
So this is for my core 3, obviously. Logic and the limits to know. It's with Father Laracy.
Yes, that's my guess. And Father Laracy's here, right? I see you in attendance.
Hello, everyone.
Hello,
Father
thank you so much
Laracy.
for coming.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to Joseph's presentation.
So are we. Thank you. Okay, Joe, you know how to share your screen?
Yep.
Okay.
Let me just go to slideshow. Okay. So, as previously, let me go back one slide. as previously mentioned, we're going to be talking about AI and basically how it relates to our law nowadays. The reason why I was so interested in this topic is because I am a computer science student with a minor in cybersecurity. And I've recently had a bit of a change of heart. I want to go into law. So these are some topics that really interest me. And I think we can all agree that it is a big part of our future. And in order to kind of navigate the future landscape, kind of need to think critically about this. So as previously said, this is for my logic and the limits to know class. The research topics that we're going to discuss, they kind of relate to our topics in the class, which relates to logic, math, and some other topics within the broader context of like Christianity's view of the human person and human intelligence. So today, I think, like I said before, we can all agree that AI has the power to kind of revolutionize not only the legal realm, but kind of all aspects of our life, whether it be at work or otherwise. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to go over various aspects of AI, such as the logic that's used to kind of build it, and then some potential risks, and how how it applies to our law nowadays, applications of it. So let's start off with the logic behind AI. So artificial intelligence is rooted in concepts of logic and computation, and even sometimes mathematics. And if we look into these foundational principles, we can kind of gain some insight into what it is truly capable of and its applications in various domains, including law. So the first one that I explored is knowledge representation. This pretty much just includes different ways of presenting data sets and learning sets to these algorithms. Obviously, if you format it in a different way and if you present it to these algorithms in certain ways, it might take out different insights. And ultimately, it might recognize different patterns based on the way that it is presented to the algorithm. So what this does is it allows AI to effectively store, manipulate, and utilize the data that it is presented with. Next up, we have I did some research in machine learning. So machine learning very much mimics kind of like the human brain as well as neural networks, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But machine learning it allows AI to learn patterns and make different predictions from data. And what it does is it does it in a couple of different ways. This might include supervised learning, which includes providing a data set that has labeled entities, which makes it a little bit easier to find those trends and different patterns that it's supposed to recognize. Unsupervised data is basically just unlabeled data, which makes it a little bit more difficult to recognize those patterns. But basically, what unsupervised learning is trying to do is it's trying to have the AI adapt to kind of unseen circumstances and try to find those patterns without it being given that extra help with it being labeled. And then reinforcement learning, again, is very much similar to the human brain. What it does is it kind of mimics trial and error. So basically, it just tries different things. If it fails, it tries again, much like the human brain, much like many of us learn today. And then lastly, neural networks, which is contained within machine learning and knowledge representation for that matter. This one truly resembles the brain, and it basically uses a whole bunch of interconnected nodes, which it's supposed to model the structure of our brain. And what it does is it powers deep learning algorithms, and it is especially useful in image recognition and natural language processing, which is one of the primary uses of AI nowadays, is to kind of replicate our language. And I'm sure we've all maybe tried AI at some point, and it can kind of be a little bit robotic in terms of like the answers that it gives you, but with neural networks, it's better at identifying the structure of our language and replicating it. So that leads us to some potential risks. Obviously, not all data sets are without bias or without discrimination. So if you feed some data to an AI system that has some bias in it, the results and the interpretations that it might get from it might also have bias. So it's always important to kind of sift through the data that you give it in order to make sure that it doesn't have any of that bias or discrimination within it. And if you don't, it could, obviously, if we're going to put it to use in things like law, it's going to result in unfair treatment of certain individuals, and it could also just undermine the trust that people have in the legal system. Next up, we have some privacy concerns. So if you're feeding a large amount of data to these algorithms, there's a strong possibility that the data might have some personal information of certain individuals. And while that is useful in certain applications, it does bring up a bit of a concern, because you don't want to be sharing people's information with just AI. And then if it's a public tool, you know it could be used by outside sources, and it kind of breaches people's privacy and security, which poses some significant issues with their rights. Next up, we have liability for AI generated outcomes, and we'll talk more about this. I have a bit of a real life example later on in the slides. But when we're using AI, and let's say we have an error or like some type of harmful consequence, there brings up the issue of liability, because obviously AI is not a real entity. It's a computer program. So you can't really blame AI. You kind of have to blame the people or company or whatever that is putting it to use. But then it just brings up a complex legal issue, because accountability, not only it might hinder like the adoption of AI systems, not only in legal settings, but also everywhere, because I think we can all agree that it's a part of our future and it has tremendous upside to it, but liability is a really big concern. And then lastly, some regulatory challenges that we have. AI is relatively new, so there are not a ton of laws or things put in place to kind of regulate the use of it just yet. I know Connecticut recently put in a law that says all companies that use AI systems have to be regularly audited to make sure that they're not abusing the use of AI or not using it in a harmful way. And then overall, it's just the advancement of AI and just technology in general is extremely fast. So it's really important that we put in these regulatory laws and different things to make sure that we're not abusing AI or violating people's rights. So now that we've talked about the risks, there are several applications of AI within the law, and most of these can be expanded to other industries as well. So AI can help with the automation of repetitive tasks. So that can be within law, something like document review, contract analysis, and overall just reduce time and cost for legal practitioners. It allows for them to focus on more important aspects of their work and more strategic things, such as building the argument for their cases. And overall, it would improve efficiency and productivity for lawyers and paralegals and people who work within the legal realm. Next up, we have legal research and analysis. So it helps with research because it can just analyze a large amount of data a lot quicker than me and you can. We have to sift through pages one by one, whereas it can go through perhaps a whole data set in just a few minutes or a few hours. And if trained properly, it will be able to extract insights and support these lawyers and paralegals in building their arguments and strategies. We also have decision support systems, so it can help legal professionals make informed decisions by using the previous two that we talked about, which is document review and help with research. So it can not only predict certain outcomes, but it can also assess different risk factors, and that can help avoid harmful outcomes, and it can enhance the accuracy and overall consistency of legal advice, which is better for all clients and everyone involved with different cases. And lastly, the probably the most important thing is there are two different things which are being used with AI to enhance access to justice. So we have online dispute resolution platforms and virtual legal assistance programs, which leverage AI. And what they do is it can be like a virtual chat box, or it can be just a website that is using AI to kind of provide some legal help to people who can't afford to pay for those legal fees. And I think this is something that we're going to see a lot in the future because it is free and it allows people to get the representation that they deserve without incurring those prohibitive costs. So that brings me to one example of AI misuse. This was in June of 2023. There was a notable case which involved the misuse of ChatGPT, and it kind of just highlights the complexities of AI adoption and just shows us that we really need to think about how we're going to use it and put in place those regulations. So basically what happened was it was just a personal injury lawsuit against an airline, and the attorney that was representing the client used ChatGPT for legal research to generate different case precedents. He did not realize, he did not fact check the things that ChatGPT was giving to him, and ultimately ChatGPT made up fake cases, which he then presented in court. The judge realized that these were not real cases, and he imposed different sanctions, and he scrutinized against AI and ChatGPT's reliability, and I believe the lawyer got disbarred as well. So what this does is it kind of highlights the risks of using AI, and it shows the importance of really needing to understand the limitations of it and where we can put it to use so that we're really maximizing its potential. So to wrap up, AI it has amazing opportunities, not only for the legal profession, but also just all around. But even though there is a tremendous upside, there are several ethical and regulatory challenges that we need to address. So even though it can enhance workflow and it enhances productivity and efficiency, we need to kind of mitigate that bias and data privacy concerns in order to truly put it to use. And in order for that to happen, we really need to talk with the people who make these algorithms and that put them to use so that people truly understand how it makes its conclusions and so that we can put in those regulations so that it's safe to use and protects everyone involved. And that's pretty much it. Thank you so much, everyone. And if you have any questions, I will do my best to answer.
Joseph, that was awesome. I have so many questions and comments, but I think I'd like other people to respond if you can first. Okay, I see 2 hands. Just speak out because I have multiple things to click on to see who you are.
Excellent.
Joseph,
That was,
that's really... Oh, go ahead.
no, go ahead, Father Joe.
Oh, thank you. Joseph, that was fantastic. Really a great representation of what we're trying to do in this Core 3 class, putting logic, the limits to knowledge, math, computer science into dialogue with the Catholic intellectual tradition. And you really did a splendid job engaging this very relevant research area of AI, ethics, and law. And I think you really have great promise for pursuing, your current discernment of your background in computer science and then going on for graduate studies in law. So thank you for all the hard work that you put into that, and you make me very proud.
Thank you, Father Larry. I really appreciate it.
Roger?
Yeah, that was excellent. I have 2 set of questions. The first for Joe. I find it really interesting the ways that you have presented the benefits, capability, and limitations of AI. As a faculty, I suspect that other colleagues have the same issues with students who tend to use AI in terms of their assignment and so on. I have no issue with AI. However, there must probably be ways to maximize without necessarily alienating or diminishing our voices. As faculty, what can you advise us, especially for some of us who are a little bit reluctant to allow students to use them? Do you have any tools and ways that we can communicate to our students on how to efficiently use AI? That's number 1. And then number 2 to Billy, Leanne, and Megan. That was excellent. I really appreciated the way that you were able to own the materials and share your views based on your interest and so on. My question is to see, do you see any connection between, because Megan, Leanne presented from the course that they took in peace building or peace stories course. And then Billy took a course on refugees, religion, and politics. Do you see any connection between the two? And for instance, the flux of refugees and the peace or peace building initiatives in the places that they come from. Any thoughts on how we can address or handle those? Thank you.
So should we have Joseph reply first, since yours was the first question, Rod?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of tools, I really think just adopting in terms of Canvas, I'm not entirely sure if it really recognizes like the use of AI. I know it uses like source recognition to make sure you're not plagiarizing different sources, which AI can definitely tend to do. I've definitely played around with AI before, just like using it to use different ideas and just like present me when like I think we've all kind of gotten into a little bit of a stump every now and then, and sometimes you just need a little bit of help, not generating answers, but just generating ideas. And one thing I've learned is that it sometimes will just copy straight from the internet and not reword it at all. So obviously in those circumstances, the things that we already have in place for plagiarism, it will pick up on that. But some of these more premium artificial intelligence programs, like outside of ChatGPT, that are paid for and stuff like that, they do a much better job of taking things from the internet and rewording it and making it so that, you know, it won't always be detected. Obviously, we also have entire websites which are designed to reword AI generated results, which completely bypasses all of these things that we have in place. So I think right now, although it is kind of a scary thought, that it is open to the public and students can use it. And for lack of better words, there is a possibility that, you know, we might not be using our own brains, you know, very soon. But I think it's just a matter of making those tools that can recognize when AI is being used, like in totality, because it's okay to generate ideas if you're stuck or if you're using it kind of like as a resource, but not to just give you the answer and then copy and paste and move on with your day. I think that's really where the challenge lies, and you know, hopefully in the future there will be some type of algorithm that can kind of see that and we can use it in academia.
Maybe you'll get us that algorithm, Joseph.
Maybe, we'll see.
It sounds like you would be very able to do that. Thank you. And Professor Alfani asked a question of the remainder of you as do you see connections between your presentations? Between the topics that you explored?
I mean, certainly, you know, discussion about religion as a way of providing humanitarian aid. I'm taking religious peace building this upcoming semester, or peace stories, and I'm looking forward to doing that with Professor Alfani and expanding this kind of idea of using religion as a means to unite people and exploring it as a way to provide tangible aid in crises like this, like global warming, like the global refuge crisis. I think also, I think it was Megan who did on climate change. And she mentioned how climate can disproportionately affect certain groups of people. And I think that that's another consideration that we have to make in discussing humanitarian crises is just that it's not one size fits all. In these types of situations, there's different ways that people are impacted, and the use of religion also has to be varied to accommodate those differences as well. So that's a connection I saw, if anyone else wants to jump in.
Thank you, Isabel. I see a connection between what Joseph mentioned is how AI can assist with people who can't afford legal advice and, you know, would be able to provide some assistance that way. Again, we sometimes overlook the charity that our topics address, the people who maybe not have the advantages that we have here. Anyone else see a connection?
Kind of building off of what Isabel was saying, I found it really interesting how it's interesting because I wasn't raised Catholic, so I really learned most of what I know about Catholicism from Seton Hall, which I think is very interesting because it gives me a better perspective on the world and how Catholicism interacts with it. And I think, yeah, like a lot like what Isabel was saying, there's a huge role that the Catholic Church plays in peace building around the world. And taking Dr. Alfani's course as well, Christian Peace Stories, it was really, really interesting to see the role that it plays, not only like funneling aid and material like resources and things like that, but also like socially kind of building community and helping rebuild community after like huge conflicts, like in my presentation when I was looking at the Paris attacks, like Catholicism and the Catholic Church had a huge role in building up community, even with the Muslim community. So kind of having that like interactive dynamic, I think is really helpful. And in Megan and Isabel's presentations as well, like Catholic Church played a huge role in, you know, providing support to the migrants and refugees and providing support to environmental causes and things like that. So I think it has a really big role to play. And I think that's very interesting.
Okay, does anybody else want to share?
Well, I'd just like to say, I'm sorry,
Yeah, Dr. Enright?
Yeah,
Yes,
I just
go
wanted
ahead.
to say the presentations were all really, really interesting, and I just made me very proud of our core 3 classes and our professors. 2 of our core 3 professors that were here are here, Dr. Alfani and Father Larissy. It's just really exciting things going on in these classes. So you guys all did a wonderful job. Thank you.
Yes, and be proud that you were, singled out by your professors to present here. I mean, this is quite an honor, and we're just so privileged to be here to hear your work. And I wish you all the well, all well in your future here at Seton Hall. And you're very promising careers ahead of you to do good for the world. And thank you.